Good Sunday morning, and welcome to the class. Welcome whenever you're watching and from wherever you're watching. Thank you for your interest. We're going to be looking today at a changing worldview. Very important to do that because it is that setting, that mode of thinking, that mindset that develops in the late Middle Ages that ushers in the Reformation. And soon, we're going to be talking about these gentlemen you see behind me in the recordings. So, as always, it is my prayer that what you hear is as best as can be determined the truth, and that you're blessed and that God receives the glory. So as we continue to find our theological roots, we'll look at a changing worldview, late medieval nominalism, mysticism, and humanism. We'll get to those in a moment. But first, we have to talk about why confidence in the church declined, or another way of putting it, the collapse of the medieval thought world. The church lost credibility. Why? Well, for one thing, you remember Thomas Aquinas' systematic theology, we call it the Thomistic synthesis, did a great job, wonderful theological work. He, in one sense, saved the Christian faith from the attacks of science and reason, but not everybody was fully satisfied. Conflict still existed between revelation and science in the minds of many. And the question about to what extent does the Christian have freedom as opposed to the authority of the church? And to what extent does the state have power as opposed to the church? Mistakes in papal policy, many of them. Economic problems that Europe faced during the Black Death and after that, and the papacy seemed to come up with no answers to those problems. The Black Death created problems. We'll talk about that in a moment, as well as the fall of the papal monarchy, ambitious kings, and intellectuals who dared to question Roman policy. All of these factors contributed. The Black Death, we're in the midst of a plague right now, but in the 14th century, it was a horrible plague indeed. It began in 1347 when Genoese sailors came in from Kaffa. Kaffa is a port in the Crimea, and they arrived at Messina, which is in the south part of Italy, and they brought with them this terrible plague called the Black Death. It started in 1348, spread to South France, Spain, Italy, North France, England, Switzerland, Hungary, and the next year to Flanders, Scotland, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Prussia, Iceland, Greenland. And when it began, there were symptoms such as swellings under the arm or in the groin that created these boils called buboes, and they would ooze blood and pus. And then another symbol, another sign of the Black Death would be these blotches that were black in color, looking like somewhat like a flower that would appear, and then pain and death, usually death within 5 days. But some people went to bed healthy and died in their sleep. It was horrible. In its final stage, there would be coughing and fever and spitting of blood and sweating. Yes, it progressed through actually 3 stages, the bubonic first, the septicemic when it entered the bloodstream, and the pneumonic stage. It spread rapidly. And you see here the map, if you look at the lower right, you can see the port there in Crimea where it began. It started probably before that somewhere in the east, but it came via the ships into Italy. And the effects. Well, you see here a drawing from showing the death in Florence. You can see the Palazzo Signoria and the Palazzo Vecchio in the background. About 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population died, 20 million. In some places, the total population disappeared. Villages disappeared, and some were never rebuilt. 11,000 corpses in 1 week in one graveyard in Avignon, France. In that city, 400 were dying every day. Death carts were passing continually, and the dead were loaded on those death carts. Florence lost 4/5 of its population by 1348. 800 died daily in Paris, 500 in Pisa, 500 to 600 in Vienna. In London, corpses piled up in layers. People died too quickly to be buried. And here's the point. Priests were either afraid to give last rites or they themselves were dead, which caused an anti-clerical feeling. The priests were expected to be present at the time of death to administer the sacrament of extreme unction. And people believed that they could not really be sure of salvation and entering into heaven if they were not saved by this sacrament. And the priests were not there. Of 140 Dominican monks at Montpellier in South France, only 7 lived. And then these strange graffiti appeared, the dance of death, these macabre skeletons, and children began to play a game, which they still play. Ring of rosy, pocket full of posy, ashes to ashes, we all fall down. The ring of rosy, black blotches appearing in the skin, and the pocket full of posy, people walking around smelling flowers, thinking that would protect them from the death. And the children saw people turning to ashes in their presence and realized we all fall down. It was caused by a bacteria, the Yersinia pestis, that lived in the stomach of a flea and the bloodstream of a rat. It was spread by the black rat because the black rat lived on ships, and then by the brown sewer rat. And a bite from either rat or flea could infect man. We don't know why it became virulent at this time. It was the first time it appeared since the 6th century, which is interesting because during the period of time since the 6th century, the sanitary conditions in Europe were horrible, and yet it did not appear. There were many ideas given for the death. There was an earthquake that released fumes from the interior of the earth. There was a struggle of planets and ocean. Water was rising and vaporizing until the fish died and corrupted the air, and so church bells rang to stir up the air. People believed that you could get the evil eye. Someone could give that to you. And so they refrained from looking at people directly. Of course, people thought it was the wrath of God for their sins. They blamed oftentimes the Jews, claiming they poisoned the wells. The medical faculty of the University of Paris said that death was caused by the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the 40th degree of Aquarius on March 20th, 1345. As far as attempted cures concerned, the magic sign of abracadabra in a triangle. The church provided prayers, which they expected people to swallow. Others wore an amethyst of gallstones of animals. And doctors prescribed a medicine made up of 60 ingredients, including powdered clay and snakes. One person told the Pope, living at this time in Avignon, France, to keep hot. And all summer he sat between 2 roaring fireplaces, and he didn't get the death. It's known now that that heat does inhibit the bacteria. Some people went around smelling latrines, thinking that foul odors would save them. Others, like the pocket full of posy, smelled flowers. They practiced bleeding, purging, lancing, and cauterizing. But there's some interesting results of the death. The flagellants, we talked about them last week, spiritual Franciscans, who would go around beating themselves with whips. They claimed that God's wrath was upon them, and so they were taking the punishment. So they became, in a way, substitute Christs, and thus the church condemned them. Of course, the Jews were persecuted. There was an island in the river at Strasbourg where houses were built. Jews were taken to those houses, and then the houses were set fire. They were put to death thus. But one good thing that came out of it was public health measures. In Venice, dead bodies were taken to a deserted island. You know, Venice is built on many islands, and thus the bodies did not come in contact with the living. And in Milan, the first 3 houses where the death appeared were ordered to be walled up. And so the dead, the dying, and the well were all together in the house. Such measures continued for 40 days, 40 in Italian, thus the quarantine term. Now I put in red anti-clericalism because, as said, the church wasn't there. And so people blamed the church. For many years afterwards, higher wages were possible because the labor force had been greatly reduced, and therefore the demand for labor meant higher wages. The plague reappeared every 10 years for a while and then mysteriously stopped. Now let's look at this interesting factor, the disintegration of the papacy. In the early 14th century, one of the most outrageous popes was Boniface VIII. He had issued a decree called a papal bull that every human soul on earth was obligated to be in subjection to the Pope for the salvation of his soul. He issued other papal bulls aimed particularly at the King of France, who was trying to curtail him. That's Philip IV. Philip finally got enough of it and sent a royal representative to Rome and arrested the Pope. The Pope resisted, and he actually was struck. He died subsequently, not perhaps as a result of his injury, but of shame. But at any rate, the Pope was dead. And Philip IV declared Rome to be unsafe. Therefore, he moved, that was a good excuse, he moved the papacy to France, right under his nose, at Avignon. And for 70 years, the papacy was located in France, which was very confusing to the people who always associated the papacy with Rome. It's called the Babylonian captivity of the church. And then in 1377, Pope Gregory XI was on a trip to Rome and he died in Rome. And Catherine of Siena, who was a great leader for the church at this time, we'll talk a little bit about her later, she suggested that this was a sign from God that the papacy had come back to Rome. And the Italian cardinals quickly elected an Italian pope, but the French pope did not stand down. So we have two popes. It's called the Great Schism. And this is very confusing to people, very discouraging to people. Whom do you follow? Who is the true pope, the French or the Italian pope? Well, they called a council. Councils always solve things. The Council of Pisa in 1409 selected a new pope, but the French pope and the Italian pope did not stand down. Now we have three popes. Now, by the time the Council of Constance occurred, the same council that condemned Jan Hus, there was another generation of popes, both in Italy and in France. And this time, the council selected a pope, Martin V, and the other two, the French and the Italian popes, stood down, and we have one pope again. But the damage had been done. Subsequent councils at Basel and at Ferrara, Florence, tried to create a system of constitutional government in the church that would really put the power in the hands of the council. It did not succeed, and all of these failures contribute to the loss of credibility of the Roman Church. And criticism was coming from all sides. The fact that the church demanded celibacy of its clergy meant a decline in morals because priests often took mistresses. And the feudal system, which is based on the fact that people hold land and power from their lords as vassals, that system applied to the papacy meant that the church, bishops and so forth, held their power from the Pope. He was the Lord, they were the vassals. But now Boniface and such popes were claiming that everybody, kings included, everybody on earth held from the Pope. And that was causing great criticism of the church. Also, the luxurious living of the clergy compared to the poverty of so many people. And what we call pluralism, that is a clergyman, a bishop holding more than one office, holding power in several dioceses, sometimes not even visiting a diocese of which he was a bishop. And the papal taxation that increased, especially when it's supporting two courts, one in France and one in Italy, papal tithes, anates, that is a clergyman paying his first year's income entirely to the Pope. Purveyance, which required that the Pope could travel anywhere and be taken care of, be put up in a castle, be fed, be clothed, and treated with the utmost respect. And spoils, property of upper clergy, went to the Pope when that clergyman died. Peter's pence paid by the poor. And income from vacant offices were providing fees for the Pope. And that was particularly irritating to the kings of England and France. And then a number of leading intellectuals of the time began to write treatises that proposed that the power be centered in the national states, in the kings of these new rising states. For instance, Dante Alighieri, who wrote Dante's Inferno, who wrote of monarchy, proposing that power should be vested in kings, not in the Pope. So did Marsilius of Padua in his Defensor Pacis, the defender of the peace. John of Paris, professor at the University of Paris, on papal and royal power. These and other intellectuals destroyed the idea of a papal monarch in favor of a strong national state. And then the monarchs took action. In France, King Charles VII passed the Pragmatic Sanction of Bourg in 1438, which made the French church autonomous, completely independent of papal control. And the Germans did the same thing in 1439 with the Pragmatic Sanction of Mainz. And the Spanish, Spain had just become a nation by virtue of the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile. These two monarchs combined, and we have a united Spanish state for the first time. And the Concordat of 1482 freed the Spanish church. The Council of Castilla controlled religion in Spain, and the president of that council remarked, there is no Pope in Spain. And any decree coming from the Pope had to be passed by the Council of Castilla. All of this is a result of what we call late medieval nationalism, national states arising. And we find a pattern with these national states. In all of them, capable, hardworking monarchs who take their work seriously, having a reliable council at their disposal, gaining control over the provinces, raising taxes to put the king on his own, and thus providing a standing army. Kings who had the ability to work with the National Assembly and bring rival areas under control, as well as the church, either forcefully or by alliance. And here's some examples of these late medieval absolutist kings, capable kings, all following this same pattern. France, Charles VII and Louis XI, so-called Spider King. In England, the York kings, Edward IV and Richard III, and the Tudor kings, Henry VII and Henry VIII. And in Spain, of course, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castilla combined into one nation state. In Germany, which had been weak for so long, Maximilian I asserted the power of the emperor. In Burgundy, making a bid to become a kingdom, it is at this point a duchy, Charles the Bold, very capable. And there were strong Italian states in Venice, Milan, and Florence. Now, we've looked at the so-called heretics before, and we'll call them pre-reformers, and they are going to be highly critical of the church. John Wycliffe, questioning the very need of the Pope, questioning the infallibility of the Pope, questioning sacraments, transubstantiation. And we see this appearing with so many people at this time. The argument that a pious layman has more right to perform sacraments than does a sinful priest. And the charge on the part of Wycliffe and others that the visible church has become the Antichrist, and the true church is the invisible church made up of God's elect. And using that feudal paradigm again, Wycliffe is arguing every man holds directly from God, not from the king even, certainly not from the Pope, but every man holds from God, for God is the sovereign Lord of all the world. And arguing that the scriptures alone are authoritative. These biblical nationalistic reformers like Wycliffe and Huss and Savonarola in Florence were interested in a return to the ideal of the church as represented in the New Testament. Wycliffe and Huss capitalized on nationalistic anti-papal sentiment, Wycliffe in England, Huss in Bohemia. Wycliffe paved the way for the Reformation in England by his teaching and the fact that he gave England their first Bible in their own language, and thus he's called the morning star of the Reformation. And John Huss taught, as we've seen this before, he taught the same thing as Wycliffe, though he arrived at his conclusions by his own study. He did not have anyone to protect him, and he was burned at the stake by the Council of Constance in 1415. But his followers continued. We need to notice that. That didn't put an end to the movement. And Bohemia will go on to become dominated by followers of Huss. They're divided into two groups. The Utrichists, taking their name from the fact they want the cup, they believe that the laity should receive both the bread and the wine, but also they took the position that only that which the Bible would forbid should be eliminated, whereas the Taborites rejected all in the faith and practice of the Roman Church that could not be found in Scripture. Now just stop for a moment, because here you see the difference. When the Reformation develops, the difference between the position Martin Luther took, which is that of the Utrichists. He wanted to eliminate anything that the Bible forbids, anything else that was not forbidden could be practiced, whereas those who formed the Reformed faith, Zwingli and Bucer and John Calvin and others, took the view of the Taborites that nothing could be practiced, believed, except what Scripture taught. Now, some from the Taborite group formed the United Brethren, the Unitas Fratrum, the Bohemian Brethren, the Moravian Church, and the Moravian Church exists today. It became highly evangelical under John Amos Comenius, who wrote the Great Didactic. That book may have indirectly influenced John Wesley, but more directly, John Wesley was influenced by the lives of Moravian people. And then there was Savonarola in Florence, very capable, intelligent person who was interested in reforming the church in Florence. He really wanted to reform both the church and the state, and for a while he had the support of Lorenzo de' Medici, but he fell out with Lorenzo when he began to question the art and the writings of the Renaissance in Florence. He called them vanities, and he had a burning of the vanities. After the death of Lorenzo and the failure of his son to control, actually Savonarola came to control Florence for a while, but he was so excessive in his preaching against the Pope and his failure to have the support of the de' Medici family that he was eventually hanged and burned in the public square, the Piazza Signoria, and there's a marker in the pavement today that you can see where he was burned at the stake. Now, if you see how confidence in the church was lost, what's going to replace it? And I call this a new world of thought that frames the Reformation, a change of worldview. And we'll look at three factors, three very important factors in this new world of thought. Nominalism, we've talked about that before. Nominalists denied the objective existence of universals, claimed that universals are just names or concepts. They were concerned about particulars, about objective verification of particulars. That, of course, is a result of Aristotelianism. Now, we've already talked about William of Ockham, but let me repeat, because it's very important. Ockham made a distinction between God's absolute power and God's ordained power. God's absolute power simply means God absolutely can do anything he wants. But Ockham says we must focus on what he actually did, his ordained power. That's called Occam's razor. And within the realm of God's ordained power is the Bible. You see the importance. Gabriel Biel was another nominalist, tremendously important, a great philosopher and teacher holding these same ideas. And then we've saw before that Gregory of Rimini uses this approach, this philosophy, to study the scriptures, and actually comes up with the same conclusions that we'll find the reformers reaching later. So there's an emphasis with these nominalists on what God has actually done, including and especially the Bible. Therefore, they would be discarding the church traditions and prayers for the dead and the saints and Mary and all of these things that were not biblical. Now, coming to the second important thought component of the thought world development, that is mysticism. Now, there have been mystics for a long, long time, but there are mystics at this point that we really need to notice because they begin to focus on the Christian faith and they make contributions to the Christian faith. It is an expression of heightened spiritual interest. It is a vocalization of popular enthusiasm. Now, if the people lose confidence in the church, that doesn't mean they have lost their interest in spiritual matters. They just find new ways to channel that interest. And it happens to be a time when people were very enthusiastic about their faith. They also were concerned about a greater participation of the laity, and mysticism provided that opportunity. Mystics always seek a union with God, and they do so through some means, some method, some might use the word vehicle, which might be love, which might be service, which might be prayer. But the idea is that they reach this union with God, and as a result, they will have a simple personal relationship with God. That is the thing people were looking for, and they found it in mysticism. Of course, it's a reaction to the formalism of the medieval church. It is a desire of the human heart for direct contact with God. It could be accomplished through an ecstatic experience or through deep emotion, but in any instance, it results in an immediate apprehension of God. Immediate meaning that there is no mediation, such as through the clergy and through the sacraments, but direct communication, direct relationship to God in an extra-rational way. That is, not following the path of reason. It could be a path of emotion. It could be a path of experience. It was, of course, a reaction to the overemphasis on reason by the scholastics, and it produced also the pietistic movement, which means people focusing upon Christian living, as with the Lutheran pietists, and I say also with the Moravians. Now, the Black Death caused a social unrest that made mysticism attractive with this idea of direct contact with God. There were Latin mystics in the Latin areas like France and Italy and Spain, and there were Teutonic mystics in the German areas. Latin mystics like Bernard of Clairvaux earlier, whose vehicle was love. Catherine of Siena, whom I mentioned a moment ago, this is said of her. She represented Latin mysticism at its best with her visions, which she used for good, as she opposed corruption in the papacy. She is the one who brought the Pope back to Rome. Saint Teresa of Avila in Spain. She is known for her ecstatic visions. Saint John of the Cross, her disciple. Among the Germans, very important, extremely important for the Reformation, would be Meister Eckhart. These German mystics were usually Dominicans. Now, Eckhart studied at the University of Paris and came to believe that the aim of the Christian faith should be this union with God, a fusion of divine with human essence during an ecstatic experience. He said, God must become I, and I God. He preached that the communion could be accomplished with God through Christ. In other words, Christ becomes the vehicle. Interesting experience I had in graduate school. I was taking a course that involved a one-on-one meeting with my professor once a week, and each week I was assigned a paper to write. And my professor asked me to do a paper on Meister Eckhart, well, particularly on late medieval mysticism. And he had pointed out to me that Eckhart had been accused of 26 counts of heresy, which were later dropped. I was to find out why. Well, I know that one thing that the church charged him of and could not really prove was pantheism, that is, that God is in everything. But my professor asked me to read the sermons of Eckhart, which I did. And as I read them, I thought, there's nothing wrong with this. The church can't object. He just talks about Christ and how Christ can save us and how Christ can take us to God and his work. It's all focused on Christ, Christ and him crucified. These are sermons I could preach. And so I wrote my paper. And my professor gave my paper back to me and he marked on it, Mr. Lawrence, you have missed the point. You were looking for explicit heresy. You need to look for implicit heresy. And I realized that he had completely ignored the role of the church. He had left it out. There's nothing about the church. No, he didn't attack the church. He just ignored it. And the church thought this is not right. And they brought these counts of heresy, but they couldn't prove anything and they were dropped. But also Marguerite Kemp, Walter Hilton, there were a number of these mystics. Also John Tauler, who had a particular influence on Martin Luther. He founded the Friends of God movement and carried on, these Dominicans in the Friends of God movement carried on Eckhart's tradition of teaching and also became very evangelical. They emphasized the inward experience as being much more vital than ceremonies. They had their headquarters in the Rhine Valley in Germany, and hence they were known as the Rhineland mystics. And as we have seen before, over and over again, they point out examples. All of them have examples in their own lives. And they speak of a pious layman who came to them and taught them, and that teaching was much more valuable than that of a worldly priest. Also, there was Heinrich Suso, a poet in the group who had the same ideas as Eckhart, and Rulman Merschwin, who was a banker, and he provided a religious house in which these mystics could meet. Out of this movement came a book called German Theology. And this book was very helpful to Luther in his own struggle for salvation. But the Brethren of the Common Life was one of the best outgrowths of this mystic movement. It's a part of the Devotio Moderna, the modern devotion, had its center at Deventer in Holland. Very practical, founded by John of Ruspik and Gerhard Groote. They emphasized the New Testament in this development of a mystical movement in Holland. They formed a community. They lived under a rule. They were not monks, but they did have a rule. They devoted their lives to teaching and to other practical services rather than just a passive experience of God. They put the emphasis on educating young people and built large and excellent schools. They also provided tutors for students. They took in orphans. They were concerned about service, particularly to young people. And Thomas à Kempis, a part of that movement, wrote the famous book, The Imitation of Christ, which represents this more practical emphasis, not just negative, but very positive love and humble, practical service. Now, our third factor that forms and shapes this new thought world is humanism. I'm sure you would recoil from that because humanism does suggest that man is the center, man is the measure of all things. It goes back to Greek humanism, Athens particularly. And there was a revival, of course, of interest in the classics during the Renaissance and in Greek philosophy. And in Florence, Cosimo de' Medici established the Platonic Academy of Florence, patterned after Plato's Academy in Athens. And Ficino had fallen under the influence of Savonarola, and thus Ficino translated Plato and wanted to integrate the Bible with Greek philosophy. He actually first translated Hermes Trismegistus. He was an Egyptian magician, and it's interesting that magic even comes into the mystical movement, into the humanistic movement. But afterwards, Pico della Mirandola took over the academy in Florence, and a number of people came there who took the ideas of Florence, the ideas of this Platonic Academy, back to their own home countries, including John Colet, who spent time in Florence at the Platonic Academy. He was the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. He was among the Oxford reformers. He gave lectures that developed the literal meaning of Paul's letters as opposed to the allegorical method of the Middle Ages. And the work of not only Collett, but the other Oxford reformers contributed greatly to the Reformation in England. Now, of course, the Renaissance started in Italy, and it was much more classical and we might even say pagan oriented there, but it came northward and it changed in orientation. The reason for it, trade was reviving between Italy and the north. Trade had been suspended during the Black Death and the subsequent wars, but here's a period of peace, and thus trade can resume. And the Renaissance culture of Italy followed the trade routes northward. And northern young men would then go to Italy to study. It was called making the Italian trip. It was considered the final act in a young man's education to go to Italy. And Italians would come north to work as scholars, as translators, as teachers, as secretaries. One reason they did that is that the job market was more lucrative in the north because these jobs had been filled during the early periods of the Renaissance in Italy. They were no longer seeking people in these fields, so they went north. And all of this means that the Renaissance communicates with the north. But in the north, it is more Christian in orientation. And thus they were concerned with the Bible and Christian fathers for two reasons. One, people in the north simply were more spiritual. They were more serious about their Christian commitment. But secondly, the Bible and the Christian fathers, these were the areas of work that hadn't been done in Italy. Already in Italy, critical texts had been produced of the great Greek and Roman authors and works. What remained to be done was focusing on producing a accurate text of the Bible and the Christian fathers, analyzing them and working with them. And this means an emphasis, as it was in Italy, an emphasis on the source. We call that ad fontes, back to the font, back to the source. And in the north, it is back to the source. That means really the Bible itself, an accurate text of the Bible, not a commentary on the Bible. True, all humanists believed in the perfectibility of man, and they believed that his real problem was ignorance rather than sin, and it could be corrected through knowledge. We disagree with that as Christians, but we need not to overlook the contributions that they made. It gives rise to this strange expression, Christian humanism. Here are the great leaders of the North: John Collett, Thomas More, Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples, Ulrich von Hutten, Albrecht Dürer, Johann Reuchlin, Cardinal Jimenez, and we'll talk a little bit about them. John Collett, of course, is the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. He also established St. Paul's School for Boys, which still exists. But here's the thing that is so important. He taught from the Bible directly at the University of Oxford, directly. That hadn't been done before. He's not teaching some commentary that someone has written, some writing from a theologian. He is teaching the Bible directly, textually. Thomas More was Chancellor of England under Henry VIII. He had a humanist circle in his house, in his home at Chelsea. And there he invited many people to come who were humanists and study together, including Prince Hal, who later became Henry VIII. They focused on classical studies, but they focused on church reform. And Thomas More wrote his famous satire on church corruption, Utopia. Unfortunately, he was later executed by his good friend, Henry VIII. He's the subject of the play Man for All Seasons. In France, Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples was a professor at the University of Paris, and he also taught directly from the scriptures. He was a great theologian in his own right. He developed his own theological system. He was very close to the doctrine of justification by faith, as Luther later defined, very close. The only difference, he didn't really quite understand the forensic element of justification. But he emphasized a study of the Bible textually. He did a philosophical work on the Psalms. He wrote a Latin commentary on the epistles of Paul. And, very important, he paved the way in France for the Huguenots and for the Reformation that would come from Calvin's Geneva. Cardinal Jimenez in Spain founded the University of Alcala to train clergy in the Bible. He's a cardinal, but he's very committed to this program. He printed the first Greek New Testament. He supervised the completion of the Complutensian Polyglot Bible in several languages. It is an excellent translation of scriptures. He agreed with basic Protestant doctrines. And in Germany, Johann Reuchlin, he was a professor at the University of Cologne, and he taught classics, including Hebrew and the Old Testament. He had studied in Florence under Pico della Mirandola, and he developed a taste for the Hebrew language. He wrote of the rudiments of Hebrew, which was a combination Hebrew grammar and dictionary, but it got him in trouble. And as a good example of the paranoia of the church, of the fact they had become very thin-skinned, the church leaders began to criticize him, saying, anyone who studies Hebrew is going to likely apostatize from the faith, and to teach Hebrew to young people is to give them the inclination to become Jews, to turn away from Christ. And of course, this is ridiculous. And Reuchlin wrote the Letters of Eminent Men, a treatise to defend himself. In it, he cites the true example of many successful, competent scholars, people who had studied Hebrew and had been very faithful, had not abandoned the faith. But that still didn't work. And therefore, a friend of his and fellow humanist, Ulrich von Hutten, wrote a satire, which is entitled The Letters of Obscure Men. Of course, he made up all these obscure men. They were people who were just the dregs of society. They were total washouts. They were failures. They had accomplished nothing. And all of them say, thank you, Mother Church, for keeping us ignorant. We are so grateful. We would not be the people we are today if it had not been for you. And of course, that made the church look ridiculous, and they dropped the charge against Reuchlin. In the field of art, Albrecht Dürer, the Leonardo of the North, really expresses this viewpoint, this biblical viewpoint that becomes the Reformation. And he became a Protestant later. He expresses it in his paintings, in his engravings, in woodcuts. Comes from Nuremberg in Germany. Here you see his house, which survived the bombing during World War II. Now, let's see where we've come. Let's see these three movements that contribute to the thought world in which the Reformation will develop. Nominalists contribute to the view that what is important is what God has done rather than what he could do. Thus, they place a strong emphasis on Holy Scriptures, which God revealed. Mysticism emphasized a personal relationship with God, an experience with God through various media, as opposed to the cold, impersonal ritualism of the Roman Church. And humanism emphasized the production of critical texts and a study of ancient manuscripts in the North, especially the Holy Scriptures and the Fathers, rather than the reasoning of the scholastics. We have one more person to study before we come to the Reformation, because he is so important in the Reformation, Erasmus, the so-called Prince of Humanists. Thank you for joining us today. We'll talk about Erasmus next week, Lord willing. Hope you have a great week, a blessed week, that God will indeed bless you. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ will be with you, the love of God our Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit.